We all know big corporations see their employees as numbers, disposable assets, but I never realized how literal that was until I saw the clause in my contract for the Northern Yukon pipeline project. It was listed under a section called Biotic Appeasement Protocol. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I thought it was legal jargon for don't feed the bears. I was wrong. It didn't mean we shouldn't feed the wildlife. It meant that we were the food. It started with the money. It always does, doesn't it? I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at a stack of final notice letters that looked like they were ready to topple over and crush me. The bank was threatening foreclosure, my truck needed a new transmission, and the heating bill was 3 months overdue. I was doing the math on the back of a napkin, trying to figure out which bill I could skip without the lights getting cut off, when the phone rang. It was 10:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. No good news comes at that hour. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional, and completely detached. He introduced himself as an external recruiter for Helix Energy. He didn't ask how I was doing. He just asked if I was the same Jack Miller who was certified for high-pressure underwater welding and hazardous environment containment. I told him I was. "We have a situation at a remote asset," he said. "Station 9 in the Northern Yukon. We need a Class A welder for an emergency containment seal. It's a 48-hour turnaround. We can have a chopper ready for you at 600 hours." I almost laughed. "Buddy, I don't do rush jobs in the Yukon in December. Call someone else." "The pay is $15,000, he interrupted, plus a $5,000 completion bonus upon signing the NDA. I stopped. My eyes drifted back to the stack of bills on the table. That was 6 months of mortgage payments. That was a fixed truck. That was breathing room. The no died in my throat. "Where do I sign?" I asked. The next morning I was sitting in a sterile, glass-walled office at a private airfield outside of Fairbanks. The recruiter wasn't there. Instead, I was sitting across from a suit who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He slid a contract across the mahogany table. It was thick, 50 pages of dense legalese. "Standard liability," the suit muttered, tapping a pen against the desk. "Just sign at the tabs." "I'm a blue-collar guy, but I'm not an idiot. You don't survive in my line of work without reading the fine print." I flipped through the pages, scanning the usual clauses about injury, death, and dismemberment. Standard stuff for oil and gas work. But then I stopped at page 42. Section 9, Biotic Appeasement Protocol. I frowned. I'd worked on pipelines from Alaska to Texas, and I'd never seen that term before. I read the paragraph underneath. Contractor acknowledges that the work site is located within a protected habitat. Contractor agrees to strictly adhere to all isolation protocols. In the event of a containment breach involving local fauna, Helix Energy assumes no liability for biological interaction. Biological interaction, I looked up at the suit. What is this, bears? The suit stopped tapping his pen. For a second he looked uncomfortable. He shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. "It's the Yukon, Mr. Miller. There are wolves, bears, moose. It's just legal trying to cover their bases in case you get bit by a fox while you're smoking a cigarette outside the perimeter. Don't worry about it. The station is fully fenced and monitored." He pushed the pen toward me. 15,000 for 2 days of work. I looked at the clause again, biotic appeasement. It sounded weird, almost ritualistic, but the number $15,000 was screaming louder in my head than my instincts. I picked up the pen. I signed my name. The golden handcuffs clicked shut. I spent the next hour prepping my gear. This is where I made my biggest mistake. I approached this like a job, not a survival situation. I packed my tools with the precision of a surgeon. I grabbed my arc welder, my angle grinder, a heavy-duty sledgehammer, and my thermal weather gear. I checked my oxygen tanks. I checked my mask. I'm a mechanic. I fix things that are broken. I build things that are meant to stay built. I didn't pack a gun. I didn't own a gun. Why would I? I was going to a billion-dollar facility with security fences and cameras. I thought the biggest danger I face was a frozen valve or a slip on the ice. I loaded my tool chest into the back of the transport Jeep Helix had provided to take me to the chopper. The metal clanged heavily, the sound of honest work. I remember feeling a sense of pride. I was the guy they called when things went wrong. I was the expert. I didn't know then that my welding torch wouldn't be used to fix a pipe. I didn't know I'd be using it to try and burn the face off a nightmare. As I climbed into the Jeep, the suit watched me from the office window. He didn't wave. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me leave with a look on his face that I only understood days later. It wasn't the look of a boss sending an employee to a job site. It was the look of a man disposing of evidence. The flight out to Station 9 was a masterclass in tension. The Bell 412 chopper rattled and shook against the Yukon headwinds, but the turbulence wasn't what had me gripping the safety bar. It was the pilot. Evans was a stringy guy in his 50s who looked like he'd spent too many years flying bush runs on too little sleep. For the entire 2-hour flight, he didn't say a word to us. He kept his eyes locked on the horizon, his knuckles white on the cyclic, periodically glancing down at the tree line as if he expected surface-to-air fire. I looked across the cabin at the rest of the team. Mike sat closest to the door. He was the foreman, a massive slab of a man with a graying beard and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He was ex-military, maybe Marines, judging by the way he sat perfectly still, eyes scanning the terrain, completely unbothered by the shaking aircraft. He was cleaning his fingernails with a small pocket knife, looking bored. Next to him was Ashley. She was the complete opposite. Young, maybe late 20s, with thick glasses and a nervous energy that made her tap her foot incessantly against the metal floor. She was the tech specialist, sent to handle the software side of the reboot. She had a tablet gripped in her hands like a lifeline, swiping through schematics she'd probably memorized days ago. 2 minutes, Evan's voice crackled over the headset. It was tight, high-pitched. I'm not landing. We're doing a hot drop on the south pad. Mike keyed his mic. Not landing. We've got 300 pounds of gear, Evans. Put her on the deck. I said I'm not shutting down, Evans snapped back. My contract says transport only. I am not killing the engine within 50 miles of that place. Get your gear ready to move. Now. Station 9 rose out of the white desolation like a concrete scar. It was uglier than I expected. A sprawling complex of gray block buildings, piping, and high-voltage transformers, all surrounded by a 12-foot chain-link fence topped with razor wire. A massive flare stack towered over the facility, burning a dull, angry orange against the twilight sky. Evans brought us in low, the skids hovering 3 feet off the icy concrete of the helipad. The door slid open, and the cold hit us like a physical blow. It was -30 out there, easy. Go, 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 Evans screamed. We scrambled out, dragging our duffel bags and my heavy tool chest onto the ice. The rotor wash was brutal, stinging my face with ice crystals. Before I could even check if everyone was clear, the engine pitch whined up. Evans yanked the collective, banked the chopper hard to the left, and tore away toward the south. I watched him go. He didn't bank around for a wave. He flew like the devil himself was snapping at his tail rotor. Friendly guy, Mike grunted, hoisting his duffel bag onto his shoulder effortlessly. He spat on the concrete. All right, let's get inside before we freeze. We walked toward the main airlock. The silence of the place rushed in to replace the sound of the chopper. It was heavy, oppressive. Usually, a station this size has a low-level hum, generators, pumps, the sound of men shouting over machinery. But Station 9 was dead quiet. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic whoosh of the flare stack burning off excess gas. The main heavy steel door was locked, but the green light on the keypad was blinking. The power was on. Ashley punched in the code Helix had given us. The maglocks disengaged with a heavy thud, and the door groaned open on hydraulic hinges. We stepped into the decontamination mudroom. It was warm inside. The heating systems were running full tilt. My glasses fogged up instantly. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed down the long, concrete corridor. No answer, just the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "Ops Center is this way," Ashley said, checking her tablet. "We should check in with the site manager before we start." We moved deeper into the facility. It felt wrong. I've worked on empty sites before during shutdowns or holidays. They feel dormant. This place felt interrupted. We passed the locker room. A pair of boots sat in the middle of the floor, one tipped over, like someone had kicked them off in a hurry. A heavy parka was lying in a heap near the door. "Mess hall is coming up," Mike said, pointing to a set of double doors. "Let's see if there's coffee." He pushed the doors open. The smell hit us first. It wasn't the smell of rot exactly. It was the smell of stale, stagnant air, the scent of a room that had been sealed up with something dying inside it. The mess hall was frozen in time. There were 4 tables. At the center table, 3 trays were laid out. I walked over, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. On the first tray, a steak dinner sat congealed in a pool of white grease. A fork was resting on the edge of the plate, loaded with a piece of meat, balanced as if the person holding it had just set it down to answer a question. Next to it was a coffee mug. I peered inside. The black liquid was covered in a thick, fuzzy disk of green mold. "Jesus," Ashley whispered, standing behind me. I looked at the other trays. It was the same story. Half-eaten meals, napkins crumpled on the table. A paperback book lay open, face down, preserving the reader's page. "They didn't pack," I said quietly. "They didn't leave, they were eating." Mike walked over to the serving counter. He ran a finger over the stainless steel, dust, a thick layer of it. "This food is weeks old," Mike said, his voice dropping an octave. "Helix told us the comms went down 2 days ago. They said the crew was just offline." I looked back at the moldy coffee. 2 days. That mold takes weeks to grow in a warm room. The food was rock hard, frozen solid despite the warmth of the room. Wait, no, I touched the steak. It wasn't frozen. It was just cold, stone cold. "Where are they?" Ashley asked. Her voice was trembling. I looked around the room. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no blood. It was like they had all just evaporated. "Maybe there was a gas leak," I said, trying to rationalize it. "Alarms went off, they evacuated to the safe room." "No alarms are sounding," Mike said. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the far wall. "And if they evacuated, why did they leave the doors unlocked?" He was right. I looked down at the fork balanced on the plate again. It bothered me more than the mold. You don't put your fork down like that if you're panicking. You drop it. You throw it. You put it down gently like that when you hear something, when you're listening. "We need to find the logbook," Mike said, turning back to the door. "Ops Center now." We left the mess hall, leaving the ghostly dinner behind. But as we walked back into the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The station wasn't empty. It was waiting. We left the mess hall in silence. The image of those moldy, undisturbed coffee cups burned into my retinas. The unease that had been a low hum in the back of my mind was starting to vibrate through my bones. I wanted to believe Mike's theory about a sudden evacuation, but the logic didn't track. You don't evacuate without your coat. You don't leave a fork balanced on a plate if you're running for your life. "We need to drop the gear," Mike said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Hauling this tool chest is slowing us down. We'll dump it in the residential wing, then hit the ops center." I nodded, gripping the handle of the heavy steel chest. The wheels rattled loudly on the concrete floor, the sound echoing down the corridor like gunshots. I found myself wincing at the noise, wishing we could move quietly, though I couldn't explain why. The residential wing was located at the end of the north corridor. Like the rest of the station, it was built to withstand the apocalypse. The walls were reinforced concrete, and the entry was guarded by a heavy blast door, a slab of solid steel 3 inches thick, designed to seal the sleeping quarters off in case of a pipeline rupture or chemical spill. We reached the door. It was closed. "Locked?" Ashley asked, her voice tight. Mike stepped up to the keypad. "Let's find out." He punched in the master override code. The mechanism clacked, but the door didn't slide. It groaned. The hydraulic arm whined in protest, straining against something before giving up with a mechanical hiss. The door popped open just a crack, maybe 6 inches, and then jammed. "Hydraulics are shot," I said, stepping forward. "Give me a hand." Mike and I wedged our fingers into the gap. The steel was freezing cold. "On 3, Mike grunted. 1, 2, 3, push." We heaved. The door screeched, metal grinding on metal, sliding along its track just enough to let us squeeze through. I grabbed my flashlight from my belt and shined it onto the door's surface as I squeezed past it. That's when I stopped. My breath hitched in my throat. "Mike," I said, "hold on, look at this." I ran the beam of my light over the inner surface of the blast door, the side facing into the bunkhouse. The steel wasn't smooth, it was destroyed. Deep, ragged gouges marred the gray paint, tearing all the way down to the raw, silver metal beneath. There were dozens of them, parallel slashes that ran from the top of the doorframe down to the floor. They weren't random scratches. They were frantic. "Jesus," Mike breathed, peering over my shoulder. "What is that? Equipment damage? Did someone take a grinder to the door?" I shook my head slowly, moving closer. "I'm a welder. I've spent 20 years working with industrial steel. I know what it looks like when a grinder hits a plate or when a forklift creates a gouge." This wasn't that. I reached out and took off my glove. I needed to feel it. I ran my bare thumb over the edge of one of the deep furrows. The metal was jagged, sharp enough to cut skin, but it was the direction of the tear that made my stomach drop. The burrs of the metal were facing outward, toward the hallway, toward us. "If something was trying to break in," I whispered, tracing the twisted steel, "the metal would be bent inward, concave." I looked up at Mike, the blood draining from my face. "These grooves, they're pushed out, Mike. Whatever did this was inside the bunkhouse. It wasn't trying to get in." I looked at the depth of the cuts, 3 inches deep into hardened blast-proof steel. No human tool moved like this. It looked like a wild animal had been trapped in a cage, swiping blindly at the bars. But no bear on earth had claws that could carve through 3 inches of industrial plating like it was wet clay. "The previous crew," I murmured, the realization forming a knot of ice in my gut. "They weren't evacuated. They were locked in." "That's impossible," Ashley stammered from the hallway. "Why would they be locked in?" I didn't answer. I leaned forward, putting my face near the gap in the door. I was about to find out exactly what locked them in, but before I opened that door, if you want to survive more true horror stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You need to be ready for what's out there. Now, back to the hallway. That's when the smell hit me. It wafted out from the dark room like a physical wave. It wasn't the stale, sterile air of the mess hall. This was heavy, primal. It smelled like musk, thick and pungent, like a wet dog that had been sleeping in filth. Beneath that was the sharp tang of sulfur, like a struck match, and underneath it all, the undeniable metallic sweetness of old copper. "Blood. Do you smell that?" I asked, choking back a gag. Mike sniffed the air and recoiled, covering his nose with his sleeve. "Something died in there. Probably a raccoon got into the vents and rotted." "Raccoons don't gouge steel, Mike," I said, stepping back from the door. I gripped my heavy wrench, my knuckles turning white. "And raccoons don't lock blast doors from the outside." I shined my light through the gap into the bunkhouse. The beam cut through the darkness. The room was a wreck. Bunks were overturned. Mattresses were shredded. The floor was littered with debris. But it was empty. Whatever had made those marks, whatever had been desperate to get out, wasn't there anymore. "We need to get to the ops center," Mike said, his voice commanding again, but I could hear the crack in his composure. He was a soldier. He knew the difference between a mechanical failure and a battlefield. "We need to find the logs. Now." We backed away from the door. I kept my flashlight trained on that black gap until we turned the corner, half expecting to see Long. Dark fingers curl around the edge of the steel and pull it open the rest of the way. We left the tool chest there in the hallway. I didn't care about the gear anymore. I just wanted to find a radio that worked. I wanted to call Evans and tell him to turn that chopper around. But as we hurried toward the ops center, the silence of the station seemed to change. It wasn't empty silence anymore. It felt like the held breath of a predator that had just watched its prey walk into the trap. By the time we stepped out of the ops center, the Yukon sky had decided it was done with twilight. The gray horizon collapsed into a suffocating black, and the wind, which had been a steady howl, turned into a scream. The blizzard Evans had been so afraid of wasn't just coming, it was already here. Mike, ever the tactician, wasn't satisfied with just locking the doors from the inside. He wanted eyes on the physical perimeter. "Electronics can lie," he'd muttered, eyeing the flickering control panels. "Sensors can glitch. I want to know for a fact that the external gate is chained before this snow blinds us completely." So like an idiot, I volunteered. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to prove that the mechanic wasn't just dead weight. I pulled my parka hood tight, grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a hammer. It was a physical weight pressing against my chest, stealing the breath from my lungs before I could even use it. The snow was falling horizontally, driving into my goggles, turning the world into a swirling vortex of white noise. I clipped my safety line to the handrail and trudged toward the south perimeter fence, head down, fighting every step. I reached the gate, a heavy chain-link barrier topped with razor wire. It was closed, the padlock frozen over with a layer of rime ice. I gave it a hard tug. Solid. "Gate is secure," I shouted into my radio, though the wind snatched the words away instantly. "Copy," Mike's voice crackled in my earpiece, distorted by static. "Get back inside. Visibility is dropping to 0. I turned to head back to the main complex. The lights of the station were just hazy yellow blurs in the distance, maybe 50 yards away. I took a step, then stopped. Something moved. It was at the edge of my vision, just beyond the reach of the perimeter floodlights. A shadow, darker than the night, detached itself from the tree line. I squinted against the stinging snow. "Mike," I keyed the radio, "did you send Ashley out?" "Static." I raised my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow cone through the swirling white. At first, all I saw were the trunks of the pines, bending under the wind. Then I saw it. It wasn't Ashley, it wasn't a bear. It was crouched low near a snowbank, maybe 30 yards away on the other side of the fence. Massive, broad shoulders that looked like they were packed with corded muscle, fur that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. As my beam hit it, the creature froze. Then slowly, deliberately it stood up. My brain tried to reject what I was seeing. Bears can stand on their hind legs, sure, but they look clumsy, teetering, their bellies exposed. This thing didn't teeter, it unfolded. It rose up to a full 7 feet, its posture straight, its balance perfect. Its legs were dog-like, hocked backwards, but its torso was terrifyingly human. Broad chest, tapering waist, long arms that hung down past its knees, ending in hands that looked like clusters of knives. It turned its head. Twin points of amber light reflected the beam of my flashlight. Eyes, intelligent, predatory eyes. I stood paralyzed, the cold forgotten. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Run," my instincts screamed. "Run now." But I couldn't move. I was waiting for the roar. I was waiting for the primal, window-shattering howl that would tell me this was a monster. It didn't roar. Instead, it tilted its head back slightly, looked directly at me, and let out a sound that made my blood turn to slush. Wee-a-twoo. It was a whistle. A low, two-tone whistle, clear, melodic. It sounded exactly like a human signaling a dog or a scout signaling his squad. It was mocking, it was mimicked. And then, from the darkness to my left, deep in the trees, came an answer. Wee-a-twoo. Then another from the right, and another from behind the station. The realization hit me harder than the cold. They weren't just animals. They were communicating. They were coordinating. They were setting a perimeter of their own. Jack, Mike's voice exploded in my ear, sounding panicked. I'm picking up thermal signatures on the cams. Multiple contacts. Get inside, move. The spell broke. I spun around, my boots slipping on the ice, and sprinted toward the hazy yellow lights of the airlock. Behind me, I heard the sound of the chain-link fence rattling violently, the sound of 300 pounds of muscle hitting the wire. I didn't look back. I pumped my arms, lungs burning, the snow blinding me. The distance to the door felt like miles. Every shadow looked like a claw. Every gust of wind sounded like that damnable whistle. I hit the steel stairs of the platform, stumbled, scrambled up on all fours, and threw myself at the airlock door. I punched the code with trembling fingers. Beep, 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 error. Come on, I screamed, ripping my glove off with my teeth. I punched it again. Beep, 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 click. The maglock disengaged. I threw the wheel, yanked the heavy door open, and fell into the mudroom. I kicked the door shut behind me and spun the locking wheel until my wrists ached. I slumped against the cold steel, gasping for air, my chest heaving. The inner door opened and Mike stood there, a flare gun in one hand and a fire axe in the other. Ashley was behind him, her face pale as a sheet. Did you see them? Mike asked, his voice low. I looked up at him, shaking the snow from my hood. They didn't roar, Mike, I whispered, the terror still vibrating in my throat. They whistled at me. They whistled like people. Mike's face hardened. He looked at the sealed door, then back at me. That's because they're hunting, Jack. They aren't trying to scare us off. He racked the slide on the flare gun. They're signaling the pack that dinner is served. We didn't have time to process the fear. Fear is a luxury for when you have options, and right then, our options were rapidly shrinking to zero. Kill the interior lights, Mike barked, moving immediately into combat mode. If they can see inside, we're fish in a barrel. Keep the emergency reds only. I fumbled for the wall panel, slapping the switch. The harsh fluorescent hum died, replaced by the crimson glow of the emergency backup lighting. The room bathed in red, casting long, shifting shadows that made Mike look like a demon and Ashley like a ghost. Monitors, Mike ordered, pointing to the bank of screens on the wall that displayed the feeds from the external security cameras. Jack, watch the south perimeter. Ashley, check the roof feeds. I glued my eyes to the screen. The blizzard was a chaotic mess of white static, but through the digital grain, I could see the floodlights illuminating the snow-swept yard. I don't see them, I said, my voice tight. Just snow. Maybe they retreated to the pop. The screen labeled Cam 4. South Gate went black. Lost Camera 4, I said, my stomach tightening. Pop, pop. Cam 5 and Cam 6 winked out in rapid succession. They aren't retreating, Mike said grimly, staring at his own screens. They're cutting the power. That's not possible, Ashley stammered, tapping furiously on her tablet. The floodlights are on independent circuits. The junction boxes are 10 feet up the poles. Animals can't reach them. They aren't animals, I said, remembering the whistle. They're climbing the poles. They're blinding us. One by one, the squares of light on the monitor bank died. The yard outside wasn't just dark anymore. It was a void. The creatures were systematically removing our ability to see them, tightening the noose before they kicked the chair out. Then the sound started. It began with a thump, heavy, dull. It came from the north wall right behind the mess hall, then another thump on the east wall, then a scraping sound, long, agonizing screeches of claws testing the corrugated metal siding, searching for a seam, a rivet, a weakness. They were probing the perimeter. "They're testing the shell," Mike whispered. He moved to the center of the room, away from the walls. He was holding the orange flare gun in a two-handed grip, trained on the heavy steel door we had just come through. It looked pitifully small in his hands. A single-shot plastic toy against a pack of monsters that could climb utility poles. "Is there anything else in here?" I asked, looking around desperately. "A rifle, a shotgun, bare mace." "Nothing," Mike spat. "I checked the armory locker in the security office. Empty. The previous crew must have taken everything when they tried to leave." The scraping grew louder. It wasn't just one or two of them. It sounded like dozens. The metal walls of the station groaned under the pressure. I could hear snorting, wet and guttural, right on the other side of the steel. They were smelling us through the vents. Suddenly, a massive boom shook the ceiling. Dust rained down from the rafters, coating the red-lit room in a fine gray mist. We all froze, looking up. Another boom. Then the distinct, rhythmic sound of heavy footsteps walking across the metal roof. It sounded like sledgehammers walking. "They're on the roof," Ashley whimpered, backing herself into the corner until she hit a filing cabinet. She slid down it, clutching the satellite phone to her chest. "They're on top of us." "Call out," Mike snapped at her, not taking his eyes off the door. "Get Evans, get the RCMP, get anyone." Ashley nodded frantically, her trembling fingers extending the thick black antenna of the sat phone. She held it up, pressing the power button. The screen lit up green, a beacon of hope in the red darkness. Come on," she whispered. I watched the signal bars, searching. "No signal," she gasped. "It says antenna obstructed." "That's impossible," I said. "We're in the open. The storm might degrade the signal, but it wouldn't kill it completely. Sat phones work in blizzards." "It's not the storm," Ashley cried, her voice rising in panic. "It says physical obstruction." Above us, the footsteps stopped. Directly over the center of the ops room, directly over where the external antenna array was mounted, there was a sudden flurry of movement. A chaotic scratching, tearing sound, followed by a heavy, wet weight settling onto the metal. Then another weight joined it, and another. The ceiling panels creaked. The steel beams groaned under a load they weren't designed to carry. "They know," Mike realized, his face draining of color. "They know what the antenna is." I looked at the ceiling, imagining the scene above us. They weren't just walking on the roof. They were piling onto the transmitter. They were using their own bodies, hundreds of pounds of muscle and fur, to smother the signal. They were cutting the phone line, but they were doing it with their own flesh. "They're jamming us," I whispered, the horror of their intelligence finally sinking in. "They aren't just hunting, they're isolating the battlefield." The radio silence was absolute. No help was coming. The pilot had fled. The previous crew was dead, and we were trapped in a tin can buried in the snow, while a pack of things that knew how to cut power and jam communications played with their food. The scratching on the walls stopped. The footsteps on the roof went still. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of a decision being made. "They're done testing," Mike said softly, lowering the flare gun slightly. "They know we're in here. They know we're alone." He looked at me, his eyes hard and flinty in the red light. "Jack, Ashley found a terminal in the back that's still hardline to the company intranet. It's our last shot. If we can't call out, maybe we can message out. Go see if you can get a signal through the pipeline data stream." "What about you?" I asked. "I'm going to watch the door," he said, raising the flare gun again. because pretty soon they're going to stop knocking and start kicking. We left Mike in the ops center, a lone figure bathed in emergency crimson, guarding the blast doors with a plastic flare gun. I hated leaving him, but he was right. If we didn't get a message out, we were going to die in this dark, frozen tomb. Ashley and I sprinted down the back hallway toward the server room. This part of the facility was buried deeper underground, encased in reinforced concrete. The air here was colder, recycled, and dry. "Here," Ashley said, swiping her keycard. The reader flashed red. "Damn it, lockdown mode." "Stand back," I growled. I didn't have time for finesse. I swung the heavy steel wrench I was still clutching and smashed the card reader. Plastic shattered, sparking. I jammed the nose of the wrench into the gap of the door frame and heaved. The maglock groaned, then popped. We stumbled inside. The server room was a stark contrast to the rest of the station. It was deafeningly loud with the hum of cooling fans, and lit by the sterile, piercing blue glow of the server racks. It felt like stepping into the brain of the beast. Ashley didn't waste a second. She slid into the chair at the main admin terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Okay. Satellite is dead, but the pipeline has a hardline fiber connection for telemetry. It runs underground back to Fairbanks. If I can bridge the local admin into the telemetry stream, I can send a text packet. "Do it," I said, watching the door behind us. I could still hear the thumping from the roof, distant now but heavy. "Tell them we're under siege. Tell them to send the cavalry." "Bypassing the firewall," Ashley muttered, biting her lip. "Wait, that's weird." "What?" "There's a priority traffic flag on the outgoing stream," she said, squinting behind her glasses. "Someone else is using the bandwidth. A massive data packet was uploaded 20 minutes ago." 20 minutes ago, I frowned. "We were in the air. Who uploaded it?" "Not who," Ashley said, her voice trembling. "What? It came from the automated site controller. It's a scheduled release." She hit a key and a window popped up on the massive monitor. It wasn't a stream of code. It was a document. A execute order confirmation, stamped with the Helix Energy logo. I leaned over her shoulder, reading the text. The cold in the room suddenly seemed to seep into my marrow. "To encrypted DSIG, Pack Alpha. From Helix Global ASSETS. Subject, settlement of debt Q4 pipeline security." The header didn't make sense. Pack Alpha. Why was an oil company emailing a wolf pack? But then I read the body of the message, and the world tilted on its axis. Per the terms of the Solstice Agreement, Helix Energy acknowledges the territory dispute regarding Sector 9. To ensure the continued integrity of the northern pipeline infrastructure and to prevent damage to the flow valves, the agreed-upon tribute has been delivered to the site. I stopped reading, my breath caught in my throat. "Tribute," I whispered. "Keep reading," Ashley choked out. Tears were welling up in her eyes. "Contents of tribute, 3 units of biological livestock, adult, healthy, unarmed. Access to the containment facility will be granted remotely upon visual confirmation of the Alpha presence. Note: do not damage the facility. Consume the units, leave the hardware. Status: DELIVERED." I stared at the words, 3 units. Me, Mike, Ashley. The recruitment call, the rush to get us on the chopper, the pilot refusing to shut down his engine, the NDA clause about biotic appeasement. It wasn't a job, it was a transaction. Helix Energy hadn't sent us here to fix a server. They had sent us here because the local monster population was getting restless, and the cheapest way to keep them from tearing up a billion-dollar pipeline was to give them something else to tear up. "We're the payment," I said, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. "We aren't employees, we're meat." Ashley spun the chair around, her face twisted in a mask of horror and betrayal. They knew the whole time. That's why the previous crew disappeared. They were the last payment, and now it's our turn." I slammed my fist onto the desk, denting the metal. That pilot, Evans, he knew too. That's why he wouldn't look at us. Suddenly, a new window flashed on the screen. It was a system alert, blinking in angry red letters against the calm blue background. System alert, proximity sensor triggered. Target ID, Alpha. Initiating handoff protocol. What does that mean? I asked, pointing at the screen. What is handoff protocol? Ashley turned back to the screen, her eyes widening behind her lenses. She started typing frantically, trying to cancel the command, but the terminal locked her out. No, 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 she whimpered. The system. It's receiving a signal from the motion sensors outside the main door. It sees the Alpha. And I demanded. And it's programmed to open the doors, she screamed. Jack, the company isn't just feeding us to them. They're opening the wrapper. From down the hall, back toward the ops center where we had left Mike, we heard a sound that stopped our hearts. It was the heavy, mechanical thunk of the main magnetic locks disengaging. The sound was followed immediately by the hiss of hydraulics. The blast doors weren't breaking. They were sliding open. Mike, I yelled. I grabbed the wrench and bolted for the door, leaving the glowing screen behind. The message still blinked on the monitor. A cold, digital tombstone for 3 people who thought they were just doing a job. Status, door unlocked. Enjoy your meal. Jack, wait, Ashley screamed, her voice cracking with a desperation that froze me in my tracks. She was hammering the keyboard, her fingers blurring, but the machine wasn't responding to her. It was obeying someone else. The system is overriding, she yelled, tears streaming down her face. I can't stop it. They have root access. They're initiating the welcome protocol. I spun back to the screen. The terrifying message about Livestock had vanished, replaced by a single, pulsing command box. It blinked with a rhythmic, indifferent precision, mocking our panic. Command received, Central HQ. Override code, 88 Alpha. Action, disengage all perimeter LOCKS. No, I whispered, the wrench heavy and useless in my hand. They can't. But Helix Energy wasn't just an oil company. They were engineers. They built systems designed to move resources efficiently. And right now, we were the resource. Access granted. The text on the screen stopped blinking. It turned solid. And then the world changed color. For the last hour, we had been bathed in the claustrophobic, blood-red glow of the emergency backup lights. It was the color of danger, the color of a siege. But in an instant, the red vanished. With a hum of rising power, the main overhead fluorescents flickered and buzzed to life. The station flooded with bright, clinical, cheerful light. It was the kind of lighting you see in a hospital hallway or a grocery store. It was the lighting of a normal workday. Then came the green. Above the doorframe, the status LEDs flipped from a solid, angry crimson to a bright, inviting emerald green. System normalized, a robotic, synthetic female voice announced over the facility's PA system. Her voice was calm, polite, and utterly terrifying. Perimeter access unlocked. Visitors may enter. Visitors, Ashley choked out, looking at the ceiling speakers in horror. Then we heard it. It started as a deep, reverberating clunk that shook the floorboards beneath our feet. It was the sound of the massive electromagnetic locks, the ones capable of holding back 10,000 pounds of pressure, disengaging simultaneously throughout the entire facility. Clunk, clunk, clunk. It sounded like a prison executing a jailbreak. Mike, I roared, the name tearing out of my throat. I didn't wait for Ashley. I turned and sprinted out of the server room, my boots slamming against the concrete floor. The hallway was bright now, obscenely bright. Every shadow was gone. There was nowhere to hide. I ran toward the ops center, my lungs burning. The heavy wrench gripped so tight my knuckles felt like they were going to shatter. System normalized. the voice repeated, echoing down the corridor. Main entry opening. I skidded around the final corner and burst into the ops center. Mike was standing in the middle of the room. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the main blast doors, the heavy steel barrier that had been our only shield against the night. The hydraulic pistons hissed. It was a long, slow exhale, like the station was sighing. Slowly, smoothly, the blast doors began to slide apart. No, Mike leveled the flare gun, his hand rock steady, though I saw the vein pulsing in his temple. Close it. Jack hit the manual override. I dove for the wall panel near the door, slamming my fist into the big red button. Nothing. I hit it again, and again. The button depressed, but the mechanism ignored me. The software had locked us out. The company had taken the controls and they weren't giving them back. The gap between the doors widened. 2 feet, 4 feet, 6 feet. The wind howled in, carrying a flurry of snow that danced across the ops center floor, melting instantly on the warm concrete. The cold air swirled around us, smelling of ozone and pine. And then the smell changed. The musk hit us again, that thick copper-tinged stench of wet fur and old blood. Mike didn't fire. He couldn't. There was nothing to shoot yet, just the dark, swirling vortex of the blizzard outside the open door. They opened it, Mike said, his voice devoid of emotion. He sounded like a man who had finally accepted his fate. They just opened the front door. Run, I gasped, grabbing his shoulder. Mike, we have to move, the tunnels. We have to get to the maintenance tunnels. Mike shook his head, his eyes locked on the darkness beyond the threshold. They're faster than us, Jack. If we run, we die tired. We die either way if we stay here, I screamed, pulling at his tactical vest. Then a shape materialized out of the snow. It stepped onto the threshold, the bright fluorescent lights of the station washing over it. It was the Alpha. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, its fur a matted tapestry of gray and black scars. It stood on 2 legs, its posture arrogant, regal. It didn't rush in. It didn't snarl. It stepped through the open doors with the confidence of an owner entering his own home. Its yellow eyes swept the room, ignoring the banks of computers, ignoring the flashing green lights. It looked right at Mike. Then it looked at me. It pulled its lips back, revealing gums that were black as tar and teeth that looked like yellowed ivory daggers. It wasn't smiling. It was tasting the air. Behind it, 3 more shapes emerged from the storm, moving low to the ground, slipping into the facility like shadows given weight. The robotic voice chirped again, cheerful and oblivious. Welcome to Station 9. Please report to the site manager for check-in. Mike raised the flare gun. Check this, he snarled. He pulled the trigger. The flare exploded out of the muzzle with a deafening thump, a streak of magnesium fire that turned the bright room into a blinding white supernova. The Alpha roared, a sound that shook the very fillings in my teeth, and swiped at the burning projectile. Go, Mike screamed, shoving me backward so hard I stumbled. Get Ashley, get to the tunnels, G.O. He racked the slide, loading his second and final flare, and stepped toward the monsters. I didn't want to leave him. Every fiber of my being screamed to stand and fight. But I had a wrench and they had claws that could tear through steel. Mike was buying us seconds. I couldn't waste them. I turned and ran back toward the hallway, the sound of roaring and the wet tear of flesh filling the air behind me. The siege was over. The slaughter had begun. The magnesium flare didn't just light up the room. It incinerated the shadows. For a split second, the ops center was bleached white, a blinding flash that seared the silhouette of the Alpha into my eyes. Then came the smoke. Thick, acrid, choking smoke that smelled of burning chemicals and singed hair. I was halfway down the corridor when I heard the impact. It wasn't the sound of a fight. It was the sound of a collision, like a car hitting a deer at 60 miles an hour. The floor vibrated under my boots. Come on, you ugly bastard, Mike roared. His voice was raw, defiant, the last shout of a man who knew he was already dead. There was a second thump, the flare gun firing again, followed by a high-pitched, inhuman shriek. But the shriek was cut short by a sound I will never forget as long as I live. It was a wet, heavy crunch, like a bundle of dry branches being snapped over a knee. Mike didn't scream, he just stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the roaring. It was sudden and absolute, broken only by the wet, rhythmic sound of tearing. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cowardice rose up in my throat like bile, but my legs kept moving, powered by a primal terror that overrode every shred of loyalty I had. I sprinted toward the junction where Ashley was waiting, her face a pale mask of shock in the ruthless, bright hallway lights. "Jack," she screamed, seeing me alone. "Where Mike?" "Go," I grabbed her by the jacket, nearly pulling her off her feet. "He's gone. They're inside. We have to get under the floor." "Under?" she stammered, stumbling along with me. "The vents are too small." "Not the vents," I gasped, scanning the floor as we ran. "The steam tunnels, the maintenance subgrid. There has to be a service hatch." Behind us the tearing sound stopped. Then came the clicking of claws on the linoleum floor, fast, accelerating. They were done with the appetizer. They were coming for the main course. We rounded the corner near the mess hall. There in the center of the floor was a heavy steel grate stamped with the warning, "High-pressure steam, authorized personnel only." "There," I yelled. I threw myself at the grate. It was heavy cast iron, seated deep in the frame. I jammed my fingers into the mesh, pulling until I felt my fingernails tear. "Help me," I grunted. Ashley dropped beside me, grabbing the metal. We heaved together. The grate groaned, the rust seal breaking with a sharp crack, and we dragged it aside, revealing a black, yawning square hole that dropped down into darkness. A blast of hot, moist air rushed up, smelling of rust and old water. "Jump," I shoved Ashley toward the hole. She didn't hesitate. She dropped feet first, disappearing into the steam. I heard her land with a splash and a grunt of pain. I scrambled to follow, swinging my legs over the edge. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, through the thinning smoke of the flare, a shape emerged. It was on all fours, galloping with a horrific, loping gait that covered 20 feet in a single stride. It was covered in blood, bright, arterial red that stood out shockingly against its gray fur. It saw me. It snarled, a spray of red mist flying from its jaws, and launched itself into the air. I let go. I fell 5 feet, landing hard in 6 inches of freezing muck. The impact jarred my teeth, but I didn't stop. I looked up. The square of light above us suddenly went black as the creature slammed into the opening. It was too big. The maintenance hatch was barely 3 feet wide. The creature's shoulders were 4 feet across. It wedged itself into the opening, snarling in frustration, its massive frame blocking out the hallway lights. "Move back," I screamed at Ashley, scrambling backward into the dark, low tunnel. The creature wasn't giving up. It drove a massive arm down through the open hatch, swiping blindly into the crawlspace. The arm was terrifyingly long. I watched, paralyzed, as a hand the size of a shovel slashed through the air inches from my face. The claws were black, curved, and serrated, dripping with Mike's blood. They clicked against the pipes running along the ceiling, sparking against the metal. It roared, a deafening, reverberating sound that echoed in the confined space, vibrating in my chest cavity. Dust rained down from the pipes. The creature bit at the grate frame, snapping its jaws, trying to chew through the concrete floor to get to us. We were close enough to smell its breath, a hot, rotting stench of raw meat. Drool and blood dripped from its muzzle, splattering onto my parka. "Go, go, go," I whispered, grabbing Ashley's arm and dragging her deeper into the tunnel. We crawled on our hands and knees through the slush, the pipes pressing down on our backs. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare, a maze of steam vents and electrical conduits, barely 3 feet high. We had to keep our heads down to avoid scalding pipes. Behind us, the roaring continued, but it grew distant. The creature couldn't follow. We were in the veins of the station now, the places where only rats and mechanics went. We crawled for what felt like miles, though it was probably only 50 yards. My knees were raw, my hands numb from the freezing water. Finally, the tunnel widened slightly into a junction room where the main pipeline valves were housed. I collapsed against a concrete piling, gasping for air, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Ashley curled into a ball next to me, shaking violently, her sobs echoing softly in the dark. "He's dead," she whispered, her voice broken. They just took him." I wiped the slime from my face, my hands trembling. "I know." "We're going to die down here," she said, looking at the low ceiling. "No," I said, though I didn't believe it myself. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my lighter. I flicked it on, the small flame casting dancing shadows on the wet walls. "They can't get in here. They're too big." "They don't have to get in," Ashley said, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Jack, this is the steam tunnel. It's connected to the boiler room." I froze. "If they figure that out," she whispered, "they don't have to chase us. They can just turn the heat up and cook us alive." Above us, faintly, through the layers of concrete and steel, I heard the rhythmic thumping of heavy footsteps. They were walking the grid. They were tracking us from above, smelling us through the floorboards, waiting for us to surface. We were safe from their claws for now, but we were trapped in the gut of a machine that our own company had turned into a weapon, and the monsters upstairs had the keys. We didn't wait for them to find the boiler controls. We crawled. We moved through that black, suffocating maze for hours, dragging ourselves over jagged bolts and freezing slush. The tunnel system seemed endless, a sprawling intestine of concrete and steel that ran beneath the frozen earth. Every creak of a pipe sounded like a footstep. Every hiss of steam sounded like a snarl. I don't remember much of the last mile. I remember the cold settling into my bones, turning my movements into jerky, robotic spasms. I remember Ashley's breathing becoming shallow, ragged. We were shutting down. Hypothermia was doing what the wolves couldn't. Then I saw it, a faint, gray rectangle of light ahead of us. It was an emergency exhaust vent, located at the far edge of the facility's perimeter, near the access road. The grate was rusted, held in place by bolts that looked like they hadn't been touched in 20 years. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. It gave me the strength to kick. I lay on my back in the muck and kicked that grate until my boots were shredded and my ankles screamed. On the 10th kick, the rusted bolts gave way. The grate flew off, landing in the snow with a muffled thud. We dragged ourselves out into the blinding white of the storm. We were miles from the station. The facility was just a glow on the horizon, obscured by the blizzard. We stumbled toward the highway, a desolate strip of ice-backed asphalt that cut through the forest. I waved my arms at the first set of headlights I saw. It was a long-haul trucker, a guy hauling timber down to Whitehorse. He must have thought we were ghosts. He pulled over, wrapped us in blankets, and blasted the heater. I couldn't speak. I couldn't tell him what was back there. I just stared out the window at the tree line, watching for eyes. The hospital in Fairbanks was a blur of bright lights and beeping machines. They treated us for severe hypothermia, frostbite, and shock. They asked us what happened. I was about to tell them. I was about to scream about the wolves, the lockdown, the blood. But then the suits arrived. 2 men in charcoal gray suits walked into my hospital room the next morning. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't ask how I was feeling. One of them simply placed a tablet on my bedside table, while the other stood by the door, blocking the exit. "Mr. Miller," the man by the bed said. His voice was calm, reasonable, and terrifyingly flat. "We understand you and Ms. Davis experienced a traumatic event at Station 9. A gas leak is a terrible thing. Carbon monoxide poisoning causes hallucinations, paranoia, erratic behavior. It wasn't a leak, I croaked, my throat raw from the cold. It was a massacre. Mike is dead. Michael sustained fatal injuries during the evacuation, the suit corrected smoothly. A tragic accident involving heavy machinery. His family has been compensated. He tapped the tablet. A document appeared on the screen. It was a settlement agreement. The number at the bottom was staggering, enough to pay off my house, fix my truck, and live comfortably for 10 years. This is a non-disclosure agreement, he said. It states that you agree with the official findings of the safety investigation, accidental death due to gas leak exposure. If you sign, the funds are transferred immediately. If you don't. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I looked at the man by the door. I saw the bulge under his jacket. I thought about the pilot, Evans, running for his life. I thought about the asset liquidation email. They had killed Mike. They had fed us to monsters to save a pipeline. If I talked, I wouldn't just be sued. I would disappear. I looked at the number, then I looked at the suit. "Where is Ashley?" I asked. "Ms. Davis has already signed," he said. "She's being transferred to a private facility for recovery." I signed. I took the money. I paid off my mortgage. I bought a new truck. I moved 3 states away to a place where it never snows. But here is the part they didn't account for. When we were in the server room, right before the green light came on, I didn't just stand there. While Ashley was screaming, I pulled the flash drive from the terminal. I have the email. I have the digital signature of the order authorizing the unlock. I have the proof that Helix Energy trades human lives for quarterly profits. I haven't gone to the news. The news is bought. If I went to CNN or The Times, I'd be dead in a car accident within a week, and the story would be buried. So I'm telling you, the people who listen to stories in the dark, the people who know that not every monster is hiding under the bed, some of them are sitting in boardrooms. I'm releasing this story as fiction on this channel. That's my insurance. If I disappear, the file goes public everywhere. But until then, consider this a warning. If you're a welder, a mechanic, or a roughneck looking for work in the North, read the contract, check the fine print, and if you see a clause about biotic appeasement, or if the pay seems just a little too good to be true, walk away. Because to them, you aren't the employee, you're the cattle.